Welcome to the Bipolar Buzz podcast, where we slice stigma surrounding mental illness one episode at a time, and we give others courage to do the same. I am your host, Lay, a wife, mom, daughter, sister, coworker, and friend who also lives with bipolar 1 disorder. So, without further ado, let's slay. I remember back in January of 2017 when I first experienced psychosis, kind of the overarching feeling that everybody was experiencing was confusion, if you can call that a feeling. So I, of course, was probably the most confused of everybody. And then there were my parents who had become privy to what had happened to me, and even I would say the health providers and the mental health professionals, everyone just seemed confused because after I had been given medication to come down from the psychotic episode that I had experienced and to kind of dissipate the manic symptoms, I was completely quote unquote normal. And I remembered everything about who I was and where I was supposed to be, where I last was before everything just kind of went awry in my brain. But I was sitting with a psychiatrist when I was hospitalized in the psych ward, and he just kind of was asking me questions and talking to me, trying to figure out what had happened to me. And he said that based off of what he knew and what he could go on, I had brief psychotic disorder, which is a diagnosable mental health disorder in the DSM. And so the difference between brief psychotic disorder and maybe some of the other mood disorders, a lot of it has to do with duration of symptoms and number of symptoms, etc. But that was my initial diagnosis. And so after I was discharged from the hospital, I had been given instructions to continue taking my medication, of course. So find a psychiatrist, nurse practitioner, or somebody who could continue to prescribe those medications for me, and also seek therapy, whether that was inpatient treatment or outpatient treatment. And I did that, and I bounced around between among a lot of psychiatrists and nurse practitioners and therapists, and because I was back and forth between Georgia and Alabama at the time. So Georgia, where I was in school, and Alabama, where my family was, and I eventually ended up in Alabama because I wasn't able to finish my doctoral program. I had been told before I was discharged that, there was a possibility that I was bipolar, and then there was also kind of this schizophrenia kind of being tossed around in there too. And so confusion, like I mentioned before, nobody really knew what to call it, what was going on. They hadn't really given the episode time to take its course to know how long it would have lasted. Not saying that they should have, but that's one of the criteria, is the duration of symptoms. But because I was on medication, the duration was cut short. And but anyway, so there was brief psychotic disorder versus bipolar disorder versus schizophrenia. And so I was talking to the psychiatrist in Georgia for a while, and I had told him what had happened to me, and he was like, I'm not really sure that you have bipolar disorder, because I guess he wasn't convinced that I had experienced depression. He wasn't convinced that I had experienced hypomania. And at that point, I decided, I need to advocate for myself, because I had been doing research at that point about, what had happened, and I needed to know, because brief psychotic disorder, as far as I understand, like, you don't necessarily need to be on medication for life, but with bipolar disorder, a lot of people say that you do. And so the treatment for it looks a little bit different. And also, because of the mood shifts in bipolar disorder, I would need treatment for the depressive episodes as well, were I to experience another depressive episode again. But he did not think I had bipolar disorder. It wasn't until I permanently moved back to Alabama and went to a mental health facility in Alabama, and spoke with a therapist there who said, you know, without a doubt, you have bipolar disorder. She did a questionnaire for me to kind of figure out the symptoms that I was experiencing, which my psychiatrist had not done. And she said it was very clear to her that I had bipolar disorder. And, you know, because of all of that confusion in the beginning and the people thinking that I could have brief psychotic disorder versus bipolar disorder versus schizophrenia, of course that eventually led me to think, like, did I fake this? Did I make it up? Am I a fraud? Am I just, you know, making people think that I am mentally ill when really I am totally fine? And it's so easy to do, especially when you have things like that happen to you, where people are questioning your diagnosis, or they're not sure of your diagnosis, or they don't know what to call it. And so the thing though that kind of helped me to kind of come out of that am I a fraud mentality, the imposter syndrome kind of that I had placed on myself, like I'm pretending to be bipolar when really I'm not, is that when I experienced the psychosis, I could not fake that. Like, there was literally, I had pressured speech. I was seeing things, hearing things that other people didn't see or hear, and like I had an answer for everything when I was talking to people, and there was no pause. Like, it was just, that's just how fast and irrational my brain was working during the time of my episode. And I had been reading a lot about the kindling effect. So I actually experienced psychosis a second time in December of 22. And so anyway, the kindling effect basically states that in the beginning, so when you have your initial episode, it's triggered by these psychosocial stressors in your life, but with subsequent episodes, there is less of a trigger needed in order to cause an episode. So it can kind of happen on its own without any trigger, you know, the more subsequent episodes that you have. And that was one of the fears of one of my nurse practitioners when I told her that I wanted to eventually start a family and come off of my medication. She said, well, you know, if you come off your medication, it's going to be harder to recover if you relapse. But in my head, I was like, but we've been talking for months now, and I've been stable all this time. You've taken me off of my antidepressants, and we basically decided that I am in a euthymic state, so I am neither experiencing depressive mood states or manic mood states. So, you know, there was just a lot of confusion. And I remember being hospitalized the second time, so in December of 22, talking to somebody who was in the hospital with me. She actually was telling me, you know, like the label, the diagnosis, she was telling me that it didn't really matter. And to an extent, I do agree with that, as long as the symptoms are being treated and the mental health need. So you know that I experience psychosis, so whether it's schizophrenia, bipolar, whatever, as long as the medication and the treatment that I'm on works for me, it shouldn't matter too much what you call it. But I know that just on a personal level, being able to call it something and being able to identify with other people who might be experiencing the same thing is important for me. And also, there are little differences between the mood disorders, and it's important to catch those differences because you don't want to fall into a relapse because you weren't being treated for the right thing. But in essence, I understand what my friend in the hospital was telling me. She was just saying, you know, as long as you're being treated for it and it's working for you, like, it shouldn't matter too much what you call it. So I do think, and I do know that I have bipolar 1 disorder, but it wasn't just like this cut and dry, like this happened to you and automatically you get this diagnosis. Like, it can be a journey to get the diagnosis that you need and subsequently the treatment that you need in order to help you manage that diagnosis. So for anybody who might be struggling with, you know, do I have pre-psychotic disorder? Am I schizophrenic? Do I have bipolar disorder? Or whatever you might be struggling with, just understand that you kind of got to do your shopping as it comes to mental health professionals, and you want to find somebody who specializes in mood disorders or whatever it is that you've got going on, because they're going to be the ones who are the most knowledgeable about how to diagnose you. And find somebody who cares, who doesn't really dismiss you or your experience, your symptoms, anything that you've gone through in the past that you think might be relevant. And I would say, as far as feeling like a fraud, it's very easy to think that, and that's why a lot of people come off of their medication, because they're like, well, obviously I don't need it, but I had done that and I relapsed. So it's unfortunate, but there's just so much unknown about mental health in general. So definitely be empowered by taking ownership of your diagnosis. Not saying that it should define you, but just allow yourself to become educated about what it is and how it affects you, because it's going to affect everybody differently. Even though it's one name for a disorder, I'm going to experience it differently than somebody else who has the same disorder. So just take that into account and monitor your moods and your symptoms, and people who are close to you, who love you, whom you love, that can help you stay on track. Definitely keep them in the know, and just be cognizant of how you're feeling. And if you ever get to that point where you're like, I don't know if, I'm really bipolar, or I don't know if I'm really schizophrenic, or whatever it is, just make sure you're talking to your mental health professionals and getting them to just kind of reality check you. But I just hope that you're taking care of yourself, and that you're staying well, and that you have people in your corner, people in your space who are interested in what's best for you. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bipolar Buzz podcast, where we have the courage to slay stigma. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe for more and share with a friend.